Chapter 6 Forging a Nation. Independence turned us into the gachupines of the Indians. Guillermo Prieto. Creole independence. At the end of the 17th century, the colonizing society of New Spain was self sufficient, with regional markets in which local products circulated. The countryside was dominated by haciendas and ranches, which had displaced Indian agriculture. They were in the hands of Creoles and the rich mestizos, as shown by Enrique Florescano and Isabel Gomez Gil. The useful Mexico, the only one to which I am referring, was controlled economically by the church and the merchants, in alliance with the owners of mines, agricultural enterprises, and textile mills. The 18th century brought a new bonanza in mining, which had favorable repercussions in other activities. But the climate of well-being did not hide the grave contradictions whose unfolding would lead to independence. The Creoles' discontent fed the growth of a different social conscience in that group. At the beginning of the 19th century, they totaled 1 million inhabitants and represented 16% of the population of New Spain. Their unhappiness had several causes, some ancient and others of more recent origin. Always above all else, the Creoles were second-class Spaniards in the land in which they were born. The highest posts of the colonial administration were closed to them. There was never a Creole viceroy, and they had to struggle hard to achieve a system in which they alternated with the Spaniards in the highest posts of the religious hierarchy. They were a minority in occupying other administrative posts, since there were so many peninsulares who came across the Atlantic with royal appointments. The most fortunate Creoles enjoyed sinecures, and the most audacious found ways of rapid enrichment, even buying titles of nobility. But the true nobility remained in Spain, not in the Indies. The Bourbon reforms brought New Spain under greater control and made it more of a colony. Galvez, the visitador, or the inspecting official, sent by the crown to put the reforms into effect, tightened the screws, thus affecting Creole interests in all areas. There would be more peninsulares in positions of control. Farewell to the privileges of the El Consulado de Comerciantes, or Merchants Organization. Gone the Alcaldías Mayores, or local posts, which brought such riches to those who bought them, more fiscal accountability, and more remittance of money to Spain because the king was at war. Everything favored the growing nationalist aspirations of the Creoles. They bore the stigma of having been born here and not there. They were from this continent scorned by Europe, a continent thought inferior in its natural environment and in its people. In the Old World, they thought that nothing original or of value had been produced in America, a debased continent. The Creoles were included. The Creole response was based on two ideological pillars: Guadalupanismo and the appropriation of the Indian past. In 1648, Bachelor Miguel Sanchez made it known that the dark-skinned virgin venerated by the Indians in Tepeyac since 1531 was, in reality, a miraculous image that had remained as a direct testimony of the appearances of the Virgin herself to an Indian named Juan Diego. In her appearances, she asked him to transmit to Bishop Sumarraga her desire that a sanctuary be built for her in that place. There is no record of anyone else's mentioning her appearances before Bachiller Sanchez. Nevertheless, the cult of the Virgin of Tepeyac had spread widely, and pilgrims, mostly Indians, came from all directions to the same site at which they had previously venerated Tonantzin. It is a fact pointed out by Lafay that the name Guadalupe was unknown to the majority of the Indian pilgrims who arrived at Tepeyac, even in the middle of the 18th century. Even so, the history of the appearances was immediately accepted in New Spain, and the cult of the Guadalupana, or the Virgin of Guadalupe, spread rapidly. For the Creoles, the indisputable fact was that the Virgin Mary had chosen this land among all others. She had not appeared personally in any other nation, leaving behind her image and requesting a cult in her honor. This was the strongest and most irrefutable proof of the legitimacy and even superiority of Mexico, of America, and of the Creoles themselves in relation to Spain and Europe. This conviction turned out to be incompatible with the position of second class citizens assigned to them by their own homeland. New Spain was becoming the homeland of the Creoles. Claviero, at the beginning of his work, identifies himself as a Mexican. Farther on in the text, as noted by Lafay, the Mexicans are only the Indians. The revival of the Indian past, now assumed as the past of the Creoles themselves, we owe in large part to Claviero. This expropriation, like Guadalupanismo, was an ideological process that was necessary to destroy the assumption that domination by peninsulares was legitimate. Of course, reviving the Indian past and defending the rights of contemporary Indians were very different things. Even Father Servando Teresa de Mier did not argue for any principle of equality, nor did he argue for the abolition of slavery or of the castas. In 1811, the consul of Mexico to the court in Cadiz described the Indian thus: lazy and languid, stupid by nature, without inventive talent or the power of thought, drunk, sensual, insensible to religious truth, without discernment of social duties, and indifferent to his fellow beings. The capacity for dissociating the Indian of yesterday from the Indian of today is the mental alchemy that endures to the present. Creole discontent was able to crystallize as a national project thanks to the conjunction of a series of internal and external factors. Among these, the French triumph over Spain and the fall of Fernando VII had an explosive effect. The legitimacy of the ties between the American kingdoms and the Spanish king could be considered broken in these circumstances. Within New Spain, the Creoles could count on the permanent discontent of the Indians and of significant groups among the mestizos and the castas. In fact, it was mestizos and Creoles of the low-ranking clergy, priests to the Indians, who initiated the rebellion and kept the flame of independence alive until 1821. It was not they who finally assumed control of the new nation, but rather the rich Creoles who during the years of struggle had kept themselves carefully on the sidelines, never openly embracing the insurgent cause and on occasions fighting on the side of the royalists. Independence did not bring with it an in-depth transformation of the brand new Mexican nation. Perhaps only the project of Morelos, expressed in the Constitution of Apatzingan, contained elements that might have upset the colonial structure inherited by independent Mexico. It had this potential to the extent that it proposed forming the basic political unit from the parish, which would have made possible real participation by the majority of the population. Of course, it could have been within the framework of an exclusive Catholic orthodoxy, which Morelos apparently defended out of fear of the social anarchy that his ideological anarchy might provoke. Faced, however, with the conflicts that broke out immediately after independence, such intentions remained in the realm of planning. These conflicts continued for half a century, until Porfirio Diaz established an imperial peace. In many ways, the goals of independent Mexico did not differ very much from those postulated in the Constitution of Cadiz in 1812. It decreased the abolition of Indian tribute and the disappearance of the castas as categories for establishing different social rights and obligations. Also, in accordance with the liberal spirit of the time, it set forth that wealth should be privately owned, a proposition that the reform would convert into national reality. In these and other points, the influence of the Spanish Constitution of 1812 made itself felt as the years passed. This influence was as important as, or perhaps more important than, the constitutional models provided by France and the United States. On the other hand, the situation of national independence signified a fundamental change compared with New Spain's previous status. Independence created a new social-political entity, Mexico or Anahuac, as was suggested at one point. Its citizens became the owners and exclusive beneficiaries of all of the patrimony and all the wealth contained in the national territory. The new identity of Mexican implied precisely that, to accept oneself and be accepted as a member of a collectivity with rights to control and use the national patrimony. This patrimony included the land with its products and riches, the profits from industry and commerce, the ways of ascending the social scale, and the guaranteed rewards which that signified. The common defense against outsiders, a right of national pride, based on the glories of the past, the present, and the future, and the commitment to share a common destiny. All this made it necessary to define a national enterprise which would first specify who the Mexican citizens were and what qualifications they should have to be able to exercise their corresponding rights. Second, it would specify the ways in which those Mexicans would control and administer the national patrimony, which was their exclusive possession. The turbulent history of the 19th century and, in reality, all the history of Mexico until the present day may be understood as a succession of confrontations between social groups. In this confrontation, each group has struggled to impose its own vision of the above rights and responsibilities upon the others, or to defend itself from some other dominant vision which was imposed on them against their will and their self-interest. This has been a difficult situation to resolve inasmuch as Mexico grew out of a colonial society in which social differences, polarized by the presence of two different civilizations, have been employed to justify the successive domination of different minority groups over the majority. The Promised Land. The territorial definition of the new nation was a primordial question for its first citizens. In principle, they inherited a land divided into 5 provinces since the last years of Spanish domination. That could have been the territory whose riches and potential constituted the patrimony of the Mexicans. Very quickly it was reduced by the independence of Central America, and a short time later by the loss of more than half of the remaining territory, lost to the military power and the greed of the United States. The defense of the borders, especially the northern border, was a constant headache and led to measures that are reflected in many of the characteristics of modern Mexico. The concern with colonizing the north was present from very early times in New Spain, and it grew constantly. Quite varied methods were attempted to draw the population concentrated in the central region toward the north. Thousands of Indians were taken there by force. The gente de razón were offered advantages they did not have in other areas. Nevertheless, the north remained barely populated. The liberals took a step forward, encouraging the formation of landholdings of gigantic size. In that land where no one lived, there were only Indians. Since they were savage Indians, used to making war on intruders, and good horsemen, they seemed to be everywhere. Small numbers of them needed large extensions of land to survive, and they defended those lands. They were a constant worry for the gente de bien, or the good people of means, a continual menace that diffused the enthusiasm for colonizing the north. War and extermination were the responses during the 19th century. The free Indians of independent Mexico were not recognized as independent nations. Such recognition was out of the question, since it implied renouncing control over the enormous extensions of land they occupied. They were either Mexicans who had to submit to the laws of the country, or they were rebels who threatened the national sovereignty and therefore were enemies and traitors to the homeland. Building a nation in the north was a new conquest, a new armed invasion with more powerful weapons and up-to-date arguments. The Indians had to defend themselves from both the Mexicans and the North Americans. Those who fled from this side were exterminated on the other, and those who crossed the border heading south were pursued and engaged here to the extent that Mexico's military power permitted. Every means was used against them. Moise Gonzalez lists the rewards earned by Indian hunters. In Chihuahua in 1859, 200 pesos were paid for a dead warrior, 250 for a prisoner, 150 for a live woman or child, and 100 for a dead one. Prices were still the same in 1883, 250 for a prisoner and 200 for a scalp. Live Indians were priced somewhat higher because they were always North American adventurers to buy them. Reluctantly, some treaties were signed. For example, a treaty with the Comanches in 1843 spoke of alliance and protection. In 1850, the government of Chihuahua signed another with the Apaches. As part of the Treaty of Guadalupe, there were negotiations to try to require the United States to stop Indian invasions from the north. The Indians who stayed on the northern side of the new border from that point forward became North Americans. The agreement did not last long since Santa Anna eliminated this provision in the Treaty of La Mesilla. Some peoples resisted in spite of everything. The Yaqui and Mayo rose up in 1825 under the youthful leadership of Juan Banderas and did it again from 1885 to 1905 under the command first of Cajeme and later of Tetabiate. Don Porfirio sent many Yaqui to Yucatan in chains for being, quote, obstinate enemies of civilization, end quote. There they escaped from the Henequen plantations to begin their return on foot to their own land, thus writing one of the most prodigious epics in the struggle for liberty. It was only one episode among dozens in the same country and during the same century. At the other end of the national territory, royal privilege had allowed Yucatan to maintain the encomienda system during the whole colonial period. Yucatan reached the middle of the 19th century, converted into a cluster of haciendas whose full potential had been realized through Henequen exports. The Maya Indians, peons who worked and lived in absolute serfdom, kept the government in check during the rest of the 19th century and into the beginning years of the 20th. Confronted by the Maya, liberalism did not hesitate to apply measures that violated its own principles, even selling Maya as slaves to Cuba, crudely disguising the arrangements as quote-unquote voluntary contracts. The disarticulation of independent Mexico resulted from the existence of provinces and later states that contained the seeds of self-rule and that were prone to autonomy. They were the cause of the bloody conflicts suffered by the country during the first decades of national rule. The struggles between Federalists and Centralists were formally won by the first group, but in reality by the second. The Mexico Profundo was involved only insofar as it was Indians and serfs who died in the skirmishes and battles. The argument was not with them. It was really a confrontation to see if the wealth of the country, in all its various expressions, was to be for all Mexicans, referring to the dominant group, or whether each province, each region, and each local boss should enjoy first rights to it. The Indians served only as a pretext, and as cannon fodder. The larger problem for the Indians was the struggle against breaking up the communal lands. The liberals, beginning with the Bourbons, made private property sacred. For them, the true citizen was a property owner, and land was the basic kind of property. A modern civilized nation was a society in which each individual had a piece of property, large or small, according to the abilities and virtues of the owner. There was no other road toward the greatness of nations, the liberals thought, or rather, copied from others. Individual work was based on individual self-interest, which in turn was based on private property. This being the case, the communal ownership of land in Indian communities became an obstacle to be removed immediately. The laws of Cadiz were already a step in this direction, and the movement took form very quickly in independent Mexico. In Mexico City in 1824, it was decreed that the communal lands of San Juan and Santiago, which had survived the whole colonial period, be broken up. However, the resistance was so great that the objective could be only partially achieved. Allotments were not made to individuals, but only to villages and barrios. In 1827, the government of Michoacán decreed the division of communal lands, and soon other states tried to do the same. Later, laws of the reform were passed in order to divide communal properties throughout the country, but the matter did not proceed as desired. In Veracruz, for instance, by 1882, only 4 or 5 communities had divided their lands, and that into large groups of co-owners. When the revolution broke out in 1910, more than 40% of villages had conserved their communal lands in violation of the law. As Gibson has very well put it, in Mexican history, significant changes have rarely occurred as a consequence of law. Law provides an approximation of historical happening or a commentary upon it. Nevertheless, the liberal policies of the imaginary Mexico had disastrous effects on the Mexico Profundo. The large landholdings grew at the expense of the communal lands in a process that either flaunted the law or was protected by it. The growing numbers of Indians without land had no alternative except peonage on the haciendas. They were a source of cheap labor held by debt or by force. The Indian was supposed to face all of this as an individual, cut off from his communal lands and organization with no resources other than his own strength. It was an imposed way of becoming a modern liberal citizen. Legal equality was another fallacy of the liberals' imaginary Mexico. The Indian was forsaken even more by removing the few prerogatives conceded during colonial times, the most important being the communal ownership of land. The interminable rosary of Indian rebellions in defense of their communal lands will be dealt with in greater detail later. There were many of them all over the country, and they were violent and at times long-lasting. The nation that was desired had to imitate the European model and soon the model of the neighbors to the north. For the liberals, Luis Gonzalez points out, there was an insuperable antagonism between the historical antecedents of Mexico and her future greatness. The Indian was a deadweight. Breaking with the past was considered a patriotic obligation. Quote, the semi-fabulous glory of the Aztec kings refers to a period in a civilization that can be of interest only to the antiquary, wrote Jose Maria Vigil. Juarez's opinion about those relatives who shared his own origins is painted by Justo Sierra, who indicates that the greatest wish of the Benemerito, or the worthy national hero, was to, quote, remove the indigenous family from its moral prostration, from superstition, from mental wretchedness and ignorance, from its physical abjection, its alcoholism, to a better condition, even though it might have to occur slowly, end quote. Curiously enough, there were other opinions. For Maximilian, the Indians are the best people in the country. The bad ones are those who call themselves the decent folk and the clergy and friars. He created a mixed commission of Mexicans and Europeans to study the life conditions of the Indians. There was no result. The Empress decreed the abolition of corporal punishment on the haciendas, reduced the workday, and established limits on servitude for debt. Neither was there any result. A country so full of Indians, more than 60% in 1810, could not seriously aspire to modernity and progress, the liberals seem to have thought. The Indians' tendency to sell little and buy only what was indispensable made them enemies of the panacea of the time, free trade and free enterprise. Their clinging to ancestral techniques was the negation of the new God embodied in technology. Some sensed an impending tidal wave. Manuel Castellanos thought that the Indians were, quote, inert before intellectual progress through aversion to those they called conquistadors, end quote. In any case, the vision of the role Indians might play in the national society was not far removed, in essence, from the view of the encomenderos and, later, the 17th century Creoles. The Indians were a disgrace to the homeland, an obstacle to being completely French or North American, which seemed the only imaginable ways of being Mexican. Something had to be done, and there were occasional attempts to do it when the internal and external wars left time for it. What was necessary was to attract immigrants to improve the race and to provide the impulse the country needed. Some had arrived on their own to fill the void left by the Gachupines, who left precipitously when independence was achieved. Frenchmen, Englishmen, Germans, and gringos hurried to find their place amid the juicy new business opportunities. But those who came were few. The insecurity of a new country with a reputation for being barbarous and unhealthful kept them away. All possible facilities had to be offered to them, and Mexico had to be announced as a land of conquest and rapid enrichment. During Porfirio Díaz's first term, it was possible to import more than 10,000 immigrants, including Italians, Cubans, Canary Islanders, Chinese, and Mormons. In spite of all efforts, the people with blonde hair and blue eyes did not come, but after all, it was better than nothing. One had to take into account the matter of security, of being constantly threatened by Indian rebellions. The solution suggested by the extremely liberal Dr. Mora was to admit all the foreigners who wanted to establish themselves in Mexico under whatever conditions and without hesitating about the methods to achieve this end. Once they have established themselves as indicated, it is equally necessary to give them government support with preference to immigrants of all the classes of color, in every way that is not an open violation of justice. Years later, some citizens, worried about the fate of the Indians and organized in the Sociedad Indianista Mexicana, expressed themselves in the following terms, quote, "Sociology teaches us that crossing with others is the best way of waking peoples composed of relatively pure races from their torpor, when they still have within themselves material that can be modified. The mixture of ethnic elements produces progress. I do not know of a single case of civilized individuals of the bronze races who choose similar partners. They all tend instinctively to better their own race." End quote. Mixture, on the other hand, should not be indiscriminate. Quote, "The mixture of the Chinaman with the Indian gives as a result the most degenerate type, physically and morally, that can be imagined. Let foreign capital come quickly, and especially Englishmen, to stimulate with their impulse our grateful regions, which will receive them with open arms and give them all possible guarantees. But do not bring Chinamen, for the English themselves would not receive them in their beloved home." End quote. The national patrimony was, after all, the patrimony of only a few, who would have preferred to share it and increase it with white foreigners and not with brown Indians. Governor Enrique C. Creole of Chihuahua thought that 100,000 European immigrants were more valuable than 500,000 Indians. With the white man, it was affirmed, came technology, the spirit of enterprise, good manners, and progress. With the Indian came only lethargy, sly hatred, and treachery when one's back was turned. They were undesirable fellow citizens, even though they were the majority. And they pretended that their lands, which were part of the patrimony of all Mexicans, were theirs alone and were not for sale. The two civilizations were marching along different paths. The Indian as enemy. What happened to the imaginary Mexico throughout the 19th century? It was a country that wanted to be rich and modern. Wealth was understood as the natural result of individual work and found expression in private property. Differences in wealth were justified by the greater or lesser effort that each individual put into producing it. This was a personal matter, which should not be influenced by previous conditions, such as having been born in one or another casta during the period of Spanish domination. Now, all Mexicans were equal, and each one was responsible for his own destiny. The cultural patrimony of the country, which included its natural resources, was common property to be exploited by each person in his own way, competing freely with the others without privileges for any particular group. The modernity of the imaginary Mexico was an imported product. Technological advances were to play an important role. The iron rails will resolve all the political, social, and economic questions that the self-sacrifice and blood of two generations have not been able to resolve, thought Manuel Maria de Zamacona. The customs of the advanced countries, including their political customs, their styles, their public entertainment, should be imitated. Legislation was repeatedly passed to construct the modernity of Mexico according to the French or North American model. Both models struggled to be dominant and resented the wars and invasions that took away their prestige during particular periods. The Mexico Profundo turned out to be the radical denial of the imaginary Mexico. The struggle over land, for example, involved one side which wanted free trade and individual property, while the other side protested that land was communal and inalienable. This was the most evident proof of an irreconcilable difference. But there was not just the problem of land. Everything that was Indian was seen as the enemy of the imaginary Mexico. From independence until the Revolution, in accordance with the ideology of the time, the government's concern with the Indians almost exclusively was first to put an end to their ancient institutions and second, to repress them during their rebellions. The free Indians of the North, the Indians who defended their lands in the rest of the country, the Indians who were incited to take part in foreign struggles, the communal Indians fighting among themselves over the boundaries of their neighboring lands, which had been maliciously ambiguous since colonial times, These sorts of Indians, which included almost all of them, constituted an intolerable threat to the peace and tranquility demanded by the imaginary Mexico. Force was employed to put them down. Military recruitment was utilized, since the barracks civilized the Indian, quoted in Gonzalez Navarro 1954, page 162. This was the manner in which Manuel Bolaños Cacho conceived the problem, writing in no less a source than the Boletín de la Sociedad Indianista Mexicana. Quote, the solution, then, is the forced adaptation of the Indian between his current manner of being, which is close to bestiality with liberty. In the hope of improvement within relative tyranny, we opt for the latter. Against the landholders, the Indians have occasionally risen up, although weakly. They have not even tried to oppose the recruitment ordinance, and they have watched impassively as the jefe politico, or local political boss, draws lots to choose recruits. They also watch impassively as families march away, to return who knows when, if ever, or as the head of the household leaves, or the brother, or even the son. And when the recruit returns, he is superior to any of his countrymen, in spite of all the vices he may have acquired. Thus, in reality, the truth is that military recruitment has been an indirect method, although poor in the numbers affected, of improving the intellectual and moral condition of the Indian. End quote. To civilize is a key expression. In Mexico, civilizing has always meant de-Indianizing, imposing the ways of the West. Since the Indians were here and were the majority, the solution in a modern country was to civilize them. In part, this meant to pacify them, domesticate them, and their violence. Quote, we should not rest content until we see each Indian with his ox goad in his hands, behind his team of oxen, tilling the land, warned Don Porfirio. The best solution, and the surest, would have been to whiten the population with the civilized contributions of European immigrants. It was the formula for resolving a problem that was understood as racial. During the 19th century, even advanced liberals like Mora accepted the quote-unquote racial inferiority of the Indian. But immigration failed. There remained schooling as a redemptive force, the new panacea for de-Indianizing Mexico. Many talented people of the time put their efforts into education. There was an initial problem, linguistic diversity. Ignacio Ramirez even proposed that Indian languages be used in Indian education, but majority opinion finally triumphed, straightforwardly rejecting that possibility. Francisco Pimentel, arguing with Altamirano over the path that Mexican literature should take, tried to write the epitaph for the Mesoamerican languages. Quote, Castilian is, as a matter of fact, the dominant language in the Mexican Republic. It is our official language and our literary language. The Indian languages of Mexico may be considered dead, quoted in José Luis Martinez, 1976, 321. There was nothing left to do with the spoken languages of the Indians except bury them, along with everything else Indian. The most basic problem was not the diversity of languages, but something of even greater significance within national reality. The rich, modern, imaginary Mexico was to be found only in certain corners of the larger cities. Programs of education were begun and made notable achievements, but they did not cross the colonial barrier, the urban perimeter. They rarely made it to the rural areas and were hardly attempted in the Indian communities. When they were, they sometimes encountered open and even violent oppression from the Indians themselves. The Kickapoo, for example, had received permission from President Juarez to locate in Coahuila. In 1909, they burned the school that had been built for them on the same day it was to be inaugurated. Other such rejections occurred in other parts of the country. In Mexico City, the San Gregorio School lasted for some time. It had been founded by the Jesuits, and its original mission was to train Indian priests. Following independence in 1824, a revealing debate about the school took place. If the Indians were citizens equal to all the others, there was no reason they should have an exclusive school. It would signify a continuation of the discriminatory and paternalistic practices of the Spaniards, which had contributed so much to the degradation of the Indian race. In discussing the matter, Dr. Mora proposed that the term Indian not be used to refer to a sector of society. Thus, by law, Indians should not continue to exist. Finally, it was agreed that the San Gregorio School would remain open, although little by little changes were introduced in its methods of operation, and it was finally transformed into an agricultural school for non-Indians in 1853. Thus concluded the only experiment in special education for Indians. The greatest effort had been expanded by some graduates of the school itself, such as Juan Rodriguez Puebla. On the conservative side, things were even worse. Lucas Alaman thought that teaching the Indians was dangerous, since if they knew how to read, subversive materials might fall into their hands, increasing their level of discomfort and rebelliousness. If schools did not function and the Indian did not become civilized, he at least had to be hidden so he would not be so visible. His overwhelming presence questioned in a categorical and daily way the progress of modernization in Mexico. Within the city's pulquerias, or popular drinking establishments, were prohibited, or they were allowed only on the outskirts in the Indian barrios. In Tepic and Jalisco, European-style trousers were made obligatory to replace the traditional white cotton pants, or de manta. That which was Indian took refuge in the communities, the barracks of the haciendas, and the urban slums. There it remained, facing new persecution. The Indian countryside became more impoverished. The population grew and more lands were lost. The work offered on the haciendas was hard and the pay was miserable. The situation became so grave that in 1896, the free distribution of lands to poor workers was ordered. The liberalism of the imaginary Mexico grudgingly recognized the opposing existence of the Mexico Profundo. Creole identity gave way to the ideology of a mestizo Mexico, but the deeper content did not change. There was a formal distancing from Spain, even anti-Spanish feeling in the early years, in the old metropolitan area. The homeland of the Creoles never regained its position as a model for Mexicans to follow. Little by little, the laws left behind by the colonial system were replaced, even if only to imitate other kinds of legal systems. Octavio Paz is incisive. Quote, "We mestizos destroyed much of what the Creoles had created, and today we are surrounded by ruins and severed roots. How can we reconcile ourselves with our past?" Mestizo, imaginary Mexico, even though it distanced itself from Spain, never broke with the West or even tried to do so. Aspirations for the future were to be found in another part of the West, and imitation was the path to follow. Ignacio M. Altamirano says it with nationalistic optimism, quote, "In Mexico, all of us have still not dared to give the cry of Dolores in all matters. We still receive from the former metropolis our commercial, industrial, agricultural, and literary precepts with the same fear and reverence with which our ancestors received royal edicts in which despotic kings named viceroys, forbade fiestas, or gave interesting news about the Queen's pregnancy," quoted in Jose Luis Martinez, 1976, 317. Amado Nervo, years later, would summarize approvingly the efforts of the imaginary Mexico, quote, "And consider finally that everything good we have in the country is artificial and opposed to its surroundings, and achieved, therefore, in spite of popular opinion. It is with the palpable disgust of the masses in the country that we have a liberal constitution. With the open repugnance of the people and the rich classes that we established the separation of church and state, and secularized public education, and with the patent opposition of the Mexicans that we have railroads and telegraphs, and even the republic." This concludes Chapter 6.